Welcome back to another episode of the Ultimate Tow Rig series where Grey Wolf 1 here is going through an evolution. In fact, this is stage 1 of what is going to be a multi-stage of the suspension itself. So where did it go and what are we doing here? More importantly, what are the goals of what we're trying to achieve? So for that, let's go take a step back and have a chat about it. So just like every upgrade and modification that we are doing with Grey Wolf 1 here, all of this is based from real world experience that we had out on the trail. And so on two separate occasions that I can think about, the ride height of Grey Wolf 1 actually became a bit of a problem. Now, the first is when I was trying to put the trailer into a campsite where it was, it was like a compound hill, let's call it. And the actual air deflector at the front was dragging because there was just not simply enough ground clearance on the front of the vehicle. Now, keep in mind, when the truck is normally unloaded, there is what's called a rake, which means like the rear of the truck sits higher than the front. And that is so that when you put the weight of contents, cargo, and a trailer behind you, that the truck will then inherently level out. The thing is though, is the truck is leveling out and leveling out correctly. It's just leveling out lower and less capable than what we would perhaps need or like or want when going off grid. So this is stage 1 of the suspension upgrade, and there are two specific goals in mind. So first goal is increase the ride height of the vehicle. The second goal is cost consciousness. So I could have gone out and bought many different aftermarket suspension systems, but what we're actually doing here is kind of neat because installing F150 TREMOR front struts in Grey Wolf 1 here. They will actually bolt up and it should give us approximately 0.75 inches of additional ride height. But how that's achieved has been subject to a lot of debates and question marks, and it's my hope in this video at least to address that. Now, if you're interested in more details and the nitty-gritty, I am going to upload a second video that's going to go into more of those details on the Grey Wolf Garage channel. But suffice it to say, let's take a walk over to the actual dampers themselves and figure out exactly what the difference is. All right, so here it is. On the left, this is the original damper assembly that came out of Grey Wolf 1. On the right, we have a damper assembly that has come from an F150 TREMOR. Now, there has been a lot of debate online in terms of how the F150 TREMOR achieves its front end lift. Now, some people were suspecting that it is the TREMOR knuckle, and it does use a different knuckle than a standard F150. I'm going to go again in more detail about all that on the Garage channel. But for our purposes here today, the difference in lift height is actually achieved from the damper assembly itself. Now you may have noticed that the actual height of them is the same. I have both dampers approximately the same distance from the wall with the studs oriented in the same way. So how then is this actually achieving a higher ride height than this? Well, it comes down to the spring. So interestingly enough, I found a couple of spring charts online. So this spring actually measures 18.4 millimeters. This is apparently 553 pounds per inch. The TREMOR spring measures 18.7 millimeters. So it is a thicker spring. I have not actually been able to find the exact equivalent, but I am estimating that the approximate pounds per inch is in and around the 600 pounds per inch range. But in terms of like damper size, etc., the body does not appear to be any longer, but once installed on the vehicle, that stiffer spring means it's going to stay much higher in its travel compared to a softer spring. But that is going to be interesting because the damper will have to be damped according to that stiffer spring, and thus maybe actually might have to be damped a bit softer. And this will come into play in stages 2 and beyond, but just keep it in mind that the stiffer spring will help keep the vehicle higher in its travel and require more force to push down, but to achieve the same ride characteristics need to be valved softer so that it doesn't end up riding like a dump truck. All right, that's enough in the tech department. I'm going to get this installed on the vehicle and we'll take some measurements afterwards and go from there. All right, let's do it. Okay, well, we have installed both front struts. However, something interesting to note was that after I installed it, I was expecting 0.75 inches of front lift. I instead got 1.25 inches of front lift. Now, I was chatting with someone else who's done a lot of, or I should say, more than me in terms of suspension modifications and swapping around. And they had a very good point, which is give it time to settle, because the vehicle that it came off of, they have not had any weight on them in approximately a year and a half. So right now we are going to go take the vehicle out for a drive and just try to cycle that suspension and get things moving up. And then we'll come back and we'll actually remeasure it and see where we're at then. So let's do that now. All right, so you join me approximately 1 week later, and I am pleased to report that the front did end up settling out to be approximately 1 inch lift over factory. So that's a good thing. As it sits right now, we have approximately 1 inch lift from the rear to the front. So that means if you were just trying to do a cosmetic lift on the front, or we're just trying to fit larger front tires, then you could effectively stop right here. However, if you are towing a trailer or hauling loads like with a rooftop tent or a bed camp or something like that, then you're going to take this one step further. So I ended up hooking up Grey Wolf 1 here to Grey Wolf 2, our 2024 Winnebago Micro Mini FLX. And I measured the front axle and the rear axle, and while I was not on perfectly level ground, it gave me a really strong indicator that actually at that point, with only that 1 inch of rake front or rear to front, that the rear of the truck, or Grey Wolf 1 here, was actually sitting lower, or maybe even on par best case scenario, which is not good enough for us, because as soon as you start driving down the road and hitting bumps and undulations, that means that the rear of the truck is going to be squatted compared to the front, and that's going to throw off our steering geometry, our headlights. We just simply don't want that. So to restore that, we're going to be coming into the rear here and changing out what are called the axle blocks. So I'm going to bring you in here now and show you exactly what that's all about. Now, for the purpose of the video, I've already gone ahead and removed the axle block, which you'll see here in just a moment, but that would normally sit underneath the leaf springs and above the axle. So Ford has a number of different heights of these blocks. There is, I think, 0 on a 2-wheel drive truck. 4-wheel drives get a 1.5 inches, so 1.25 inches. And the F150 Tremor has a full 1 inch over that at 2.25 inches. Now, you can find F-150 Tremor blocks. You can either purchase them through your dealer or be lucky enough to find one pre-owned. There are lots of people actually taking the 2.25 off in order to level out their truck, where we're sort of going the other way. Now, maybe those people don't need that large rake or don't want it for whatever their personal reasons are. So they do exist on the market. However, for $69.99 Canadian on Amazon.ca, you can find a quite impressively good quality axle block kit. Now, I say kit because over top of your leaf springs sit these U-bolts right here, front and rear, and they clamp onto this, which bolts underneath the axle assembly. And that's what holds this whole kit together. What we have purchased is 2 inch. Now, it's not going to be a full 2.25 like you'd find on a Tremor. It's going to give us approximately 0.75 inches of lift. Again, starting off with 1.25, now going to 2. Now you can see here that there are a couple of holes, and that's because there are two pins which sit in here, and then there are two pins on the bottom of this leaf spring, and that keeps the lift block from rotating and becoming disoriented, etc., etc. Now, something else to note is if you're going to a really tall lift block, like a 2.5 or a 3-inch or something like that, they may end up having a tab on the inside of it. Now, the reason for that is because this is your bump stop. So in the event of full compression of your rear suspension, this piece of rubber will come into physical contact around the axle tube. So by installing those really tall, like 3-inch blocks in the back, the rear shocks might end up bottoming out first before the actual bump stop comes into physical contact with the axle tube. And so those tabs simply prevent you from crushing your rear struts. Now, for our purposes, we have the Tremor rear struts, and we're going to be putting those in, but not initially, because I am very curious how the vehicle is going to sit with and without it. Because I suspect that the Tremor shocks, not only being a longer eye-to-eye with more travel, are also going to have different internal damping to help pair better with the front. So now we're going to head back over to the tailgate, and I'm going to show you exactly how the old and the new blocks look and the new hardware that's also included in that kit. All right, so here are our components. This is the original lift block or axle block that came on our 2016 4x4 F150, known as Grey Wolf 1. It has these pins, which we talked about, those corresponding holes on the axle side, and then the receiving for the pins that were on those leaf springs. So it would sit just in here like this. This end is towards the front, this end towards the rear. Now, I mention that because this axle block is pretty even in terms of height front to rear, but the 2-inch that we're installing is actually tapered. Now, according to the instructions here, the tapered end goes towards the front. So that means when you're spacing down the axle relative to the leaf springs, it's going to be slightly changing the pinion angle, which I think is going to be a good thing to preserve the geometry, etc. Not a mechanic, so ask a professional for advice. We can see again we've got the pins on the bottom just like the original, and we have the holes just like the original. Now let's take the old tape measure out here, because you might have to take my word on it, but that is bang on 2 inches. It might even be like a 1/16 of an inch over. And then the front, I actually haven't measured the front, but the front according to this is just shy of 2 inches. But what's important to note is because we're spacing it down, those U-bolts that came from factory don't have enough threads to actually accommodate the additional 3/4 of an inch that we're going to be adding. Okay, I went and grabbed the original, and you can see the difference in terms of height. So at some point, I'm going to come back in, and I'll end up cutting this a lot shorter once we decide on exactly how much lift that we're going to run in the rear end. But yeah, let's go and get it installed. All right, so I've gone ahead and removed the original or stock rear damper. And as you can see by this very rust-colored mark down here, this is inherently a 9-year-old truck. So while I have taken care of it and the previous owner very much took care of it, things do inherently just break down with age. So keeping in mind that the stage 1 of the suspension upgrade is all about cost consciousness, instead of getting replacement OE dampers, etc., or aftermarket, we've gone with Tremor. But that's not the only reason we went with this. The Tremor itself uses that 2.25 or 2.25 inch rear lift block. And as mentioned previously, that's spacing the axle down, and it could theoretically fully extend this damper, and that's called topping out. And when that happens is if you're going over a big undulation, or maybe there's like a hole, or you're just jumping the truck, whatever the case is, that top out will result typically in a clunk, because in the stock dampers, just like in the Tremor dampers, there is no sort of top out system, let's say. I'm choosing my words carefully because quite honestly, that won't come into play until later stages, if and when we get there. Nevertheless, we need a longer stroke damper to account for that raised rear ride height. And you can see there is approximately like, oh, I don't know, what's that, 2 and a bit inches between the two. But check this out. When I come in and compress both dampers, we can see that the Tremor damper is putting up a lot more resistance. So that's a good thing, because that means that all the seals and everything are fresh and there's lots of fluid and good charge and all that stuff. But there we go. So I've fully bottomed both of them out. And now check it out. They're basically the exact same length, which means the Tremor damper has a lot more stroke to it, or travel. So again, if we're not raising that bump stop, we are effectively increasing the travel. Yes, the rear lift block not only gives us an increased rear ride height to try to preserve or maintain or restore that rake, but it also necessitates perhaps a longer rear damper assembly. I'm saying perhaps because I don't know if this is actually long enough stroke, but we have this, it's fresh. This has what, 130,000-ish kilometers on it. This has 6,000 kilometers on it. So yeah, time for some fresh dampers in here. Pro tip, I don't know why, I have seen a lot of people install the upper eyelet first, and then they get a wrench and they're scraping the steel down here, and they're kind of fighting it to let gravity work in your favor. What I do is I pull the top damper bolt, there we go, words, and then I just go ahead and use my body weight and I compress the damper, remove that bolt, and then you can just lay it right down on the ground, remove the bolt here, and then remove it that way. That's how I do it, at least. So yeah, there's your pro tip of the day. All right, let's get this installed. Well, this is it. This is the final ride height for stage 1 of the suspension upgrade with Grey Wolf 1. Keeping in mind, our 2 main goals for this was cost effectiveness and increased ride height. So we utilized essentially scrapyard or pre-owned Tremor front struts, Tremor rear struts, and 2-inch Amazon lift blocks in the back. Albeit all of them are great quality products, it's just together as a system is going to be less expensive than just replacement struts alone. And that doesn't include the labor charge that you may have to incur by swapping over the front hats and springs onto those aftermarket struts. It's really only once you get into high price point or high-end aftermarket suspension that it will come as a complete assembly. So now let's take a walk over to the canvas behind me, and we'll go through some measurements that we got along the way. All right, so I brought with me my cheat sheet here because I am going to need it. Stock F150 ride height, front 37 inches, rear 39.25 inches, which gives us a rake of 2.25 inches rear to front. Adding just the Tremor front struts, keeping in mind that higher spring rate, we got 38.125 inches in the front, which was a total difference or increase of 1.125 inches. Rear remained the same, 39.25 inches, which gave us a rear to front differential of 1.125 inches. So it almost leveled it out, and it effectively did once you put really any kind of weight in the back. But we did do that trial where we hooked up Grey Wolf 2 and the rear was lower than the front. So for towing purposes, we knew that we needed to increase the ride height of the rear. At that point, we installed 2-inch lift blocks or axle blocks. Keeping in mind again that the stock lift blocks are 1.25 inches or 1.25 inches. We went up 3/4 of an inch to 2-inch, which then, no surprisingly, the front remained the same at 38.125 inches, and the rear then measured 40 inches, a difference or total increase of 0.75 inches. Now, hopefully I've earned a like for this video, because rather than also installing the Tremor rear shocks at that same time, I put everything back together and dropped the vehicle down just to isolate to see if the rear Tremor shocks would have any impact on rear ride height. And I'm glad that I did that because they did. So with the front struts, the 2-inch rear lift blocks, and now the Tremor rear shocks, we got, once more, 38.125 inches in the front, but 40.25 inches in the rear, which is an increase of 0.25 inches in the rear. Now, that's important to note because we're not adding any spring rate in the back. Nevertheless, the rear to front rake is now 2.125 inches. Now, realistically, I think it's better to still think about it as a 1.875 inch rear to front rake, because that additional 1/4 of an inch is not really sprung per se. It's just being held up by fluid and valving. It's not being held up by the rear springs. We haven't changed anything back there. So overall ride height is still yet to be determined exactly, because the difference in overall tire height that we are going to be going to. Now, those videos are going to be coming out in the weeks following. There's going to be an episode on the wheels because we're doing something really cool and unique there. And then there's another episode specifically talking about tires and how we chose tires for this particular application. So it's after those videos that we'll actually get to see the truck in its final stance and iteration and ride height. So for that, definitely stay tuned and please consider subscribing because those measurements are coming. In the meanwhile, thank you very much for watching. I sincerely do appreciate it. Like I said, if you appreciated the extra effort that I went to, or the video in general or whatever, please consider hitting that thumb up button, the like button. I'm really bad at asking because I hate asking, but a lot of you subscribers and other people have been doing that. And thank you sincerely, because what that does is it tells the YouTube algorithm that this video is worth watching, and so it'll share it to other people. And I genuinely appreciate that, and as do brands that I'm talking to about working with, they appreciate that as well. They like to see that feedback and interaction. So yeah, sincerely, welcome to all the new people that are subscribing. I'm genuinely excited and also pretty nervous about all the plans that I have for this year. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and so some might happen, some might not. There's a lot of uncertainty on my end of things. Also, you're probably wondering why we're doing so many like tech and modification videos. Well, there's two reasons. One, I'm trying to get this all done before we go out and start doing those trips. But also, I think that this is kind of the time when people are thinking about, you know, dusting off the trailer, or if you're in the southern part of the States, you're probably already out camping anyways. But yeah, I figure wintertime, springtime is probably when people are going to be doing these sorts of things and thinking about it so that they can do it and have a full season of use ahead. So lots of videos. Apologies for being non-specific there, but yeah, like I said, thank you very much for watching. I always sincerely do appreciate it. In the meanwhile, you take care, and bye for now.